It is the year 1350. A young princess, barely more than a child, stands trembling in a candlelit chamber. Around her, priests, physicians, and courtiers whisper and watch, waiting for proof of something she cannot control: her virginity. For her, this is no private matter. It is a public test, a ritual of humiliation that will decide her worth, her marriage, and even her kingdom's fate. Throughout the Middle Ages, royal daughters across Europe were subjected to rituals so shocking, so invasive, that even today they defy belief. These tests were not only about purity, but about power tools used by kings, priests, and politicians to control women whose bodies were treated as pawns in dynastic games. Tonight, we'll uncover the disturbing truth behind the so-called virginity rituals of medieval princesses, and reveal how these practices shaped politics, religion, and the very survival of kingdoms. But before we begin, where are you watching from right now? Tell us in the comments below. It always amazes me to see how these hidden stories connect people across the world. And if you love discovering the darkest secrets of history, make sure to subscribe, because here on Secret Historians, we uncover the truths that textbooks chose to forget. The Middle Ages were an era of castles and crusades, of knights riding into battle beneath banners of kings, and of dynasties rising and falling on the fragile thread of marriage alliances. But beneath all the grandeur and chivalry, there was a darker reality, especially for royal daughters. For them, life was never their own. They were born as bargaining chips, their bodies and futures exchanged in treaties, inked with blood and ink alike. And the most crucial currency of all was their virginity. In medieval Europe, the idea of a princess's purity was not simply a matter of morality or religion. It was a weapon of politics. A marriage between kingdoms was only as strong as the legitimacy of its heirs, and that legitimacy hinged on whether the bride had entered her husband's bed untouched. A queen consort was suspected of bringing illegitimate blood into the royal line. Entire dynasties could collapse. Wars could be fought over such suspicions. Kingdoms could burn. For this reason, the virginity of royal women became an obsession, not just for fathers and husbands, but for priests, physicians, and entire courts. And to prove it, bizarre, humiliating, and sometimes brutal rituals were devised. These rituals were carried out in secret chambers, behind locked doors, but their results were paraded as public truth, shaping the reputations of queens and the fate of nations. Imagine the horror of a teenage princess, often no more than 12 or 13, standing before strangers, her body inspected, her honor reduced to anatomy. It was a ritual cloaked in the language of faith and medicine, but in reality, it was about control. Control over her body, her choices, and ultimately, the future of her kingdom. The practice was rooted in two powerful forces: the Christian Church's obsession with chastity and the patriarchal structures of monarchy. The Church declared virginity the highest state of female virtue, second only to sainthood. To be a virgin was to be pure, pleasing to God, a vessel worthy of holy union. For a royal bride, it was proof not of holiness, but of political value. And monarchs' fathers, brothers, and husbands demanded proof. In France, England, the Holy Roman Empire, and Spain, chronicles record whispered accounts of these tests. Often they were conducted on the eve of marriage. Sometimes, shockingly, even before betrothal negotiations were finalized, a princess might be subjected to examination. Priests claimed it was for the moral good of the realm. Physicians claimed it was science. But for the young women forced to endure it, it was little more than ritualized violation. The procedures varied. In some courts, matrons and midwives were summoned to examine the girl's body, searching for signs of what they called the mark of untouched flesh. In others, physicians would be called, their fingers and eyes tasked with what no stranger should have been permitted. The results of these humiliating checks were reported back to kings and councils, who awaited them as though they were intelligence from a battlefield. And beyond the examinations themselves, there was the ritual of proof. On the wedding night, sheets were watched, inspected, even displayed for courtiers as evidence of consummation. A princess's most intimate moments became a matter of state record, and gossip of failure or success could shape the future of empires. Consider the case of Isabella of Hainault, married at just 10 years old to Philip II of France. Though not explicitly described as subjected to a test, chronicles reveal her value as bride lay entirely in her body's untouched state. Her youth was itself proof, but even so, advisors and clerics whispered about her fertility and purity as if they were political assets to be traded. Her destiny, like that of so many, was reduced to one brutal question: was she pure? The cruelty of these rituals lay not only in their invasiveness, but in their consequences. A princess who failed, even by rumor alone, could be cast aside, annulled, or worse, imprisoned. Accusations of lost virginity, whether true or false, destroyed reputations and reshaped alliances. Queens could be dethroned. Wars of succession could be justified, all on the basis of rituals designed to humiliate and control. These practices were rarely spoken of openly. Chroniclers preferred veiled language, euphemisms that hinted at proofs and certainties without spelling out the indecency. But between the lines, the truth emerges. Medieval princesses lived under the constant threat of having their honor reduced to a test, their worth measured by strangers, their futures decided by a ritual of humiliation. As we step deeper into this history, we must remember these were not nameless figures. They were girls and women with hopes, fears, and lives that could be shattered by a single whispered rumor or a failed ritual. And as we'll see, some of the most infamous queens in history, women whose names echo through time, faced such ordeals in ways that changed not just their lives, but the course of nations. ChatGPT, Haruka, Ohold Kindi's Secret Historians, The Most Horrific Virginity Rituals of Medieval Princesses, Chapter 2, Baslior. Buba Blumd, Ordekogda Zelikal Ingi Iltere Ve Frenzad Belgalenik Bakailik Teslarine Odaklenikaz. Kraliet Evliliklerind, Bu Iguluman Nasal Politik Bersila Hallen Geldagini, Renkvakular Ozerinden Gresigis. Chapter 2. The obsession with a princess's virginity was not an abstract ideal. It translated into very real and very public rituals that left scars on both the women forced to endure them and the dynasties that demanded them. Nowhere was this more evident than in the courts of England and France, where the legitimacy of heirs could mean the difference between peace and war. Take, for example, the tragic case of Margaret of Anjou, who married Henry VI of England in 1445. She was a young woman from France, barely 15, brought to England as a bride to cement peace between two warring kingdoms. Chroniclers of the time recorded that her virginity was not only assumed, but demanded as a condition of the treaty. Rumors that she was not pure rumors spread by political enemies haunted her marriage. Although there is no surviving record of an official test in her case, her worth was constantly measured by the question of whether she had been untouched before Henry. Her inability to produce a male heir was weaponized against her, and whispers of impurity fueled the Wars of the Roses. In France, the rituals were even more explicit. Physicians and matrons were called to verify a princess's condition before marriage contracts were sealed. These examinations, cloaked in the language of medicine, were often little more than invasions of privacy performed under torchlight in cold stone chambers. Once complete, their findings were reported to kings and councils, men who viewed the girl's body not as her own, but as territory to be mapped and controlled. One chilling account comes from the marriage of Anne of Brittany, who had two successive French kings. Before her union with Charles VIII, chroniclers note that her physical condition was confirmed by trusted matrons, A. phrase that hints at a ritual of inspection. Her value as heiress to the Duchy of Brittany was enormous, and the French crown could not risk even the appearance of illegitimacy. In the language of power, her virginity was as important as her lands. Even more disturbing were the rituals conducted after marriage. In both England and France, it was common for courtiers to wait outside the bridal chamber on the wedding night. Their task was not to ensure privacy, but to secure proof. The sheets were watched, sometimes even displayed the next morning, stained linen held up as evidence of consummation. If the proof was lacking, enemies at court could spread rumors that the marriage was invalid, that the queen was unfit, or that the king was impotent. In either case, the blame almost always fell upon the bride. Consider Catherine of Aragon, the Spanish princess who became Henry VIII's first queen. When her marriage to Henry's elder brother Arthur was annulled after Arthur's death, her virginity became the central question. Years later, when Henry sought to divorce her, he claimed that her previous marriage had been consummated, making their union invalid under church law. Catherine, humiliated but unyielding, swore that she had entered Henry's bed as a virgin. Whether true or not, the question of her virginity shaped not only her fate, but the fate of the English Reformation. The cruelty of these rituals was not only physical, but psychological. For the girls involved, often in their early teens, the knowledge that their most intimate selves would be inspected, judged, and politicized was a burden almost too heavy to bear. They were raised from birth, knowing that one rumor, one failed test, one whisper of impropriety could destroy their futures. Even more chilling is how these practices became tools of manipulation. A rival faction at court might spread false rumors that a princess had failed her test, undermining her position. Or a king might claim that his queen was not a virgin at marriage in order to annul the union and marry another. In this way, virginity was never only about the girl herself. It was about who controlled the narrative of her body and what political ends it could serve. By the 13th and 14th centuries, these rituals had become so ingrained in royal culture that they were expected. Chroniclers spoke of them casually, as if they were as ordinary as coronations or battles. Yet behind their euphemisms and polite phrases lay the brutal truth. Young women forced into humiliating examinations, their lives and legacies decided by the results. And these rituals were not limited to Catholic Europe. In Byzantium, in the courts of the Orthodox emperors, similar practices existed, sometimes even harsher, involving not only examinations, but ceremonies meant to prove purity before entire assemblies of nobles. The East and West alike shared this obsession, a cultural fixation that transcended borders and faiths. What is striking is how silence surrounded these practices. Official records are vague, chronicles evasive. But the very evasiveness speaks volumes. Everyone knew what was happening, but few dared to name it. To do so would be to acknowledge the violence, the humiliation, the degradation at the heart of dynastic politics. For the medieval princess, there was no escape. Her body was a battlefield, her virginity a prize to be claimed, inspected, and displayed. And as we will see, in some cases, these rituals did not merely humiliate, they destroyed. For medieval princesses, virginity was never a private matter. It was a weapon in the hands of kings, popes, and councils. And like all weapons, it could destroy lives. History is full of moments when accusations of impurity, whether proven, fabricated, or whispered in rumor-shattered dynasties, and reshaped the map of Europe. One of the most infamous examples is that of Joan of Navarre, who married Henry IV of England in 1403. Though she was a widow with children from her first marriage, whispers about her chastity arose the moment she crossed the Channel. Henry's courtiers, suspicious of her foreign alliances, spread rumors that she was not pure enough to be queen. Though there was no test in her case, the very question of her sexual history undermined her authority for years. She was eventually accused of witchcraft, imprisoned, and stripped of her wealth. In her fall, we see how virginity, or the lack thereof, could be twisted into a pretext for ruin. But perhaps the most chilling consequences came when tests themselves were used as evidence. In some cases, rival factions at court orchestrated humiliating inspections to undermine queens. Chroniclers describe moments when midwives or physicians were summoned not to protect, but to condemn, their findings presented to councils as though they were sacred truth. Take the case of Joan of France, daughter of Louis XI. Married to Louis, Duke of Orleans, she endured years of humiliation as her husband sought to annul their marriage. His claim? That she was malformed, incapable of consummation, and therefore not a proper virgin wife. Physicians and clerics were summoned to examine her, their reports weaponized against her dignity. Eventually, the marriage was annulled, paving the way for her husband to become King Louis XII and remarry for political gain. Joan, discarded, withdrew into religious life, canonized centuries later as a saint, but in her own lifetime, a victim of rituals and accusations designed to erase her. In England, the stakes were even higher. Catherine of Aragon's marriage to Henry VIII became one of the most notorious cases where virginity defined an empire. When Arthur, Henry's brother, died, Catherine swore she had never consummated the marriage, making her union with Henry valid under canon law. Decades later, when Henry sought divorce, he flipped the narrative. If she had been untouched, then their marriage was invalid. If she had not, then she had lied. Either way, her body and her words became the battlefield. The result was the English Reformation, a schism that tore Christendom in two all, sparked by the question of a queen's virginity. But it was not only queens who suffered. Princesses awaiting marriage often faced invasive examinations before treaties were sealed. In Aragon, in Castile, in Burgundy, young women were paraded like breeding stock, their purity reported to foreign envoys. In some cases, if doubts were raised, negotiations collapsed, alliances shattered, and wars resumed. A girl's body could end peace as easily as a broken sword. The horror extended beyond politics into daily life. For many royal brides, the dreaded wedding night proof loomed larger than the vows themselves. Sheets were inspected, sometimes by entire groups of noble witnesses. Imagine the fear of a young woman, her husband a stranger, her future at stake, knowing that even biology could betray her. For not every virgin bled, and not every sheet bore the expected stains. In such cases, silence fell heavy. And silence was often more dangerous than screams. The consequences of failure were devastating. A princess suspected of impurity might be repudiated, locked away in a convent, or sent back to her homeland in disgrace. Entire families suffered dishonor. Political enemies seized the chance to spread propaganda. In the Byzantine Empire, chronicles record how a princess once accused of failing her test was denounced publicly, her marriage annulled before it began. Her name vanished from the record, a chilling reminder of how easily history erased those who could not meet impossible demands. At the heart of it all was control. Control over dynasties, control over alliances, control over women whose bodies were never truly their own. These tests, these rituals, were cloaked in the language of faith and science, but they were neither. They were tools of power, and power cares little for truth. By the late Middle Ages, the rituals grew even more elaborate. In Spain, clerics spoke openly of virginity trials as proof of a princess's worthiness. In France, the phrase la preuve became shorthand for both consummation and the evidence that followed. In England, the court gossiped relentlessly about which queens had passed and which had not. What began as whispered rumors became public theater, humiliation performed under the guise of necessity. And yet, behind every case, Behind every annulment or rumor or sheet inspected by candlelight, there was a woman, a girl, often terrified, often powerless, whose body became the stage for dynastic drama. The horror of these rituals was not just in their practice, but in their silence. Everyone knew, but few recorded. Everyone watched, but few spoke. It was a system that thrived in shadows, where the suffering of princesses was hidden behind the walls of palaces, known only by the whispers of courtiers and the ink of cautious chroniclers. And it is here that we must ask, how many names were lost, how many lives destroyed by rituals that served no purpose but to humiliate? History remembers queens like Catherine and Joan, whose fates were shaped by these ordeals. But countless others princesses married, discarded, forgotten, left no trace. Their silence is the loudest testimony of all. By the late Middle Ages, the rituals surrounding virginity had become more than private humiliations within castle walls. They were woven into the very fabric of medieval society, legitimized by religion, cloaked in the language of medicine, and accepted as necessary by courts across Europe. What began as whispered tests in chambers became doctrines defended by priests and practices justified by physicians. Church played perhaps the greatest role in embedding these practices into culture. Virginity was celebrated in sermons, exalted in saints' lives, and demanded in continence. The Virgin Mary herself was upheld as the ultimate model of purity. For ordinary women, this meant pressure and expectation. For princesses, it meant ritual and scrutiny. To be pure was not just virtue, it was a requirement for political and spiritual survival. Priests defended the virginity tests as acts of moral safeguarding. In their eyes, a royal marriage was not simply a personal union, but a sacrament binding two realms together under God's authority. Ensuring the bride's chastity, they claimed, was ensuring the sanctity of the marriage. What they ignored was the cruelty inflicted on the young women whose bodies became battlegrounds of faith and politics. Alongside the clergy, physicians entered the scene. By the 14th and 15th centuries, medical texts began to describe signs of virginity as though it were an observable, measurable condition. Manuals spoke of the hymen, of supposed bodily indicators, of proofs that could be seen or felt. These texts gave the rituals a cloak of science, even though their knowledge was limited and often wrong. Physicians, midwives, and matrons were summoned into cold chambers, ordered to search for signs that were often ambiguous or invisible. Their words carried immense power. A declaration of purity could save a marriage alliance, while a declaration of impurity could destroy it. The irony is stark. Virginity was treated as a truth that could be proven, yet in reality, it could not. Biology did not conform to the myths of the medieval mind. Some women bled on their wedding nights, some did not. Some showed the signs physicians expected, others did not. But none of this stopped the rituals. Instead, ambiguity only increased their cruelty. For every princess declared pure, another was cast under suspicion, not because of what she had done, but because of what her body did or did not reveal. And society watched. Virginity rituals did not remain locked within royal courts. They filtered down into noble households, where lesser brides faced inspections by mothers-in-law and parish priests. Even peasants heard rumors of queens tested before marriage, their lives gossiped about in taverns and markets. Over time, the idea that virginity was something that could and should be proven seeped into the culture, shaping the expectations of women across all classes. What made the late medieval period especially cruel was how these tests were ritualized. It was no longer enough for a father or king to believe his daughter pure. The church demanded proof. The court demanded spectacle. Sheets stained with blood became political evidence, displayed before witnesses. Chroniclers, even when evasive, recorded these events with chilling detachment. One infamous example came from Aragon, where a royal wedding in the late 15th century was followed by a public display of sheets to confirm consummation. Courtiers wrote that nobles crowded to see the evidence, as though it were theater. The queen, a girl barely 14, had no voice in this performance. Her body had spoken for her, and the realm judged accordingly. Such rituals also intersected with superstition. In some parts of Europe, charms and amulets were given to brides to ensure bleeding on the wedding night proof of virginity, manufactured to protect reputations. In other cases, priests blessed beds or sprinkled holy water on sheets, sacralizing the ordeal. A girl's honor was not just between her and her husband. It was between her and the world. Behind these practices was a deep current of fear. Fear of illegitimacy. Fear of betrayal. Fear of losing dynastic control. And in a world where dynasties determined peace and war, that fear justified cruelty. It allowed kings to order examinations, priests to bless humiliations, and physicians to cloak superstition in science. For the princesses trapped in this system, the experience was one of profound isolation. Who could they trust? Their fathers, who offered them as pawns. Their priests, who demanded proof. Their physicians, who examined them. Their husbands, who stood to gain from their humiliation. In many cases, they had no one. Their bodies were not their own, and their silence was demanded. The cultural weight of these rituals cannot be overstated. By the end of the Middle Ages, the virginity of royal women had become a cornerstone of European politics, religion, and society. It shaped treaties, justified wars, and decided the fates of nations. Yet for the women themselves, it was a prison with invisible bars, built of faith, fear, and control. And as the medieval world transitioned into the Renaissance, these practices did not vanish. They evolved. They became subtler, sometimes hidden behind courtly language, sometimes dressed in new rituals of honor. But the cruelty remained. The obsession remained. And for every queen who survived the ordeal, there were countless others who did not. The age of superstition was giving way to an age of spectacle. And the virginity of princesses was no longer just a matter of rumor or ritual. It was becoming a weapon of propaganda, wielded in pamphlets, sermons, and political theater. The question was never simply, was she pure? The real question was, who controlled the answer? As Europe moved from the shadowed halls of the medieval world into the dazzling courts of the Renaissance, the old obsessions did not disappear. They simply changed form. Virginity, once hidden behind the locked doors of castles and whispered about in chronicles, became a spectacle wielded in public narratives. Where once the humiliation of princesses was contained in candlelit chambers, now it was broadcast across kingdoms in pamphlets, sermons, and court gossip. The Renaissance was an age of humanism, of art, of discovery, but it was also an age of political theater. Monarchs knew that their reputations mattered as much as their armies. And in this world of appearances, the virginity of queens and princesses became a public script, carefully crafted to shape perception, justify decisions, and legitimize power. Consider the case of Mary Tudor, sister of Henry VIII. When she was married off to the aging French King Louis XII, her youth and purity were emphasized in every dispatch. Pamphlets described her as a lily untouched, a living emblem of England's honor. When Louis died just months later, French courtiers whispered about whether her short marriage had ever been consummated. The rumors were not idle. They determined whether Mary could remarry, whether treaties held, and whether alliances shifted. Her body had become part of a propaganda war, her reputation traded like currency. In other cases, accusations of lost virginity were wielded as weapons of character assassination. Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII's second wife, is a chilling example. While there is no evidence she ever endured a formal virginity test, the propaganda surrounding her trial accused her of promiscuity, of betraying the king's bed, of shattering the sanctity of marriage. The imagery used in her downfall sermons preached, Pamphlets spread echoed the same medieval fixation: a queen's worth measured by her chastity, her fall justified by her supposed impurity. The role of the printing press cannot be overstated. For the first time in European history, rumors and accusations about queens could be spread not just in whispers, but in ink. Slander about virginity, fidelity, and purity circulated in broadsheets that reached merchants, peasants, and nobles alike. The intimate lives of royal women became public property, their chastity debated in taverns and marketplaces. A failed marriage was no longer a secret scandal. It was a public trial, with the queen's body as evidence. Religion, too, amplified the spectacle. In Protestant and Catholic Europe alike, queens were held up as symbols of their faiths. Virginity and chastity became proof of divine favor. A pure queen was a blessing from God. A fallen one was a sign of corruption. Elizabeth I of England turned this to her advantage. Branding herself as the Virgin Queen, she transformed the old weapon of control into a badge of power. Her supposed untouched state became the foundation of her authority. Her unmarried body presented as the property not of one man, but of a nation. She showed that the narrative could be flipped, that a woman could wield the obsession as a shield rather than a shackle. But Elizabeth was the exception, not the rule. For most princesses, the narrative remained a trap. If they were declared pure, they were useful pawns. If they were declared impure, they were discarded or destroyed. And in the Renaissance, the public nature of these accusations made the stakes even higher. A whisper in a court could be denied. A pamphlet printed in thousands of copies could not. One particularly cruel example came in the case of Margaret of Valois, known as Queen Margot of France. Married into the tumultuous wars of religion, her chastity was constantly scrutinized. Rumors of lovers spread by her enemies undermined her marriage and tarnished her reputation. Though never proven, the accusations shaped how history remembered her, reducing a brilliant political mind to a scandalous figure. The weapon was not the test itself, but the story told about her body. This was the evolution of the old medieval rituals. Where once midwives and physicians delivered verdicts in chambers, now pamphleteers and priests delivered them to the public. The humiliation was no less real, only broader in reach. And the cruelty lay not only in what was said, but in the impossibility of defense. How could a queen prove her innocence? How could a princess silence rumors about her most intimate self? What emerges is a pattern that stretches across centuries. Virginity was never truly about biology. It was about power. In the medieval era, that power was exercised in private examinations. In the Renaissance, it was exercised in public theater. In both cases, women were denied control of their own narratives. Their bodies were texts written upon by others, priests, kings, pamphleteers, each word another layer of humiliation. And yet, even within this system of cruelty, some women resisted. Elizabeth I wielded the obsession to her advantage. Others, like Catherine de' Medici, turned accusations into weapons of their own, deflecting attention and manipulating rumor for political survival. But these were rare triumphs in a world where most had no voice. The Renaissance prided itself on progress, on reason, on enlightenment. Yet beneath the frescoes and symphonies, the same medieval shadows lingered. The obsession with the virginity of princesses endured, evolving into propaganda, spectacle, and slander. For the women who lived it, the cruelty was timeless. And as Europe moved toward the modern era, one question remained: would the obsession finally fade, or would it adapt once again, reshaping itself in new forms for new centuries? By the dawn of the 17th century, Europe was no longer the medieval world of castles and crusades. Renaissance ideals had reshaped art, science, and politics. Yet for royal women, the ancient obsession with virginity remained, reimagined for a new age of dynastic power, The days of priests and matrons physically examining princesses in candlelit chambers had begun to fade, but only because the tools of control had changed. Virginity was no longer simply inspected. It was documented, debated, and broadcast across Europe in a polished language of diplomacy. The question of whether a royal bride was untouched could still decide the success or failure of entire alliances. Marriage. Contracts of this period frequently included clauses that emphasized purity. Royal ambassadors carried detailed reports of brides-to-be, describing not only their appearance and character, but also the certainty of their virginity. In letters between courts, words like intacta or pura were used as shorthand to guarantee political value. These phrases were diplomatic currency, proof that the bride was worthy of sealing a treaty. Consider the case of Marie de Medici, who married Henry IV of France in 1600. Though her enormous dowry made her a highly desirable bride, whispers about her past haunted her arrival. Enemies of the Medici family spread rumors questioning her chastity, hoping to weaken her influence. These accusations, though baseless, shaped how courtiers received her and influenced her early struggles to secure her place at the French court dock in England. The fixation was equally strong. When Charles I sought a French bride in the early 17th century, negotiations faltered, partly because of religious disputes, but also because questions of purity lingered. French ambassadors insisted that Princess Henrietta Maria's virginity was beyond question, emphasizing her cloistered upbringing and strict Catholic education. In their eyes, these details were not just biography, they were political assurances. The obsession extended into medical discourse. Physicians of the 17th century published texts attempting to codify virginity as a physical state, describing supposed signs and symptoms. Though science was advancing in other areas, when it came to women's bodies, superstition and control lingered. These medical proofs were invoked in legal disputes, used as justification in annulments, and cited in sermons that reminded women of their duty to remain pure until marriage, and the rituals of proof continued. In some European courts, especially in Catholic Spain, the tradition of inspecting wedding sheets after consummation persisted well into the 17th century. Courtiers still waited outside bridal chambers, eager to see evidence that the union was valid. Though cloaked in Baroque ceremony and polished manners, the humiliation remained the same, a woman's worth reduced to the stains upon linen. But what changed most in this period was the scale of gossip. The early modern world was a world of pamphlets, letters, and newspapers. Royal scandals traveled quickly, carried not just by courtiers, but by print. If a queen's virginity was questioned, the story might be told not only in private chambers, but in coffeehouses and salons. A princess's body became a public subject of debate, dissected by commoners as freely as by kings. The consequences were devastating. Accusations of impurity could still ruin marriages, spark annulments, and justify political betrayal. In Spain, whispers about Queen Mariana of Austria's chastity before marriage undermined her influence at court. In France, Marie Antoinette, though a century later, would face similar accusations. Her supposed failure to produce heirs tied to rumors of her purity and fidelity. These stories reveal how the ancient fixation endured, reshaped but unbroken. For the women themselves, little had changed. A princess in the 17th century still grew up under constant watch, her body treated as a political instrument. She might not endure the same crude examinations as her medieval counterparts, but her chastity was no less scrutinized. Her letters were read, her companions monitored, her movements restricted. Virginity had become less of a ritual and more of a surveillance system. In some cases, the obsession bordered on absurdity. Royal families hired entire entourages of female attendants, tasked with ensuring that princesses remained untouched. These attendants reported to fathers and brothers about the most intimate details of a girl's life, who she spoke to, how long she lingered in gardens, whether her gowns revealed too much of her figure. Virginity was treated as a fortress, and these attendants were its guards. By the 18th century, the Enlightenment promised reason, science, and progress. Philosophers wrote about liberty, equality, and the dignity of the individual. Yet for royal women, the same old shadows lingered. The body of a princess remained a political battleground. Virginity was still a commodity to be proven, defended, and if necessary falsely proclaimed. And here lies the cruel irony. Even as the modern world dawned, with revolutions shaking thrones and science challenging superstition, the fate of kingdoms could still rest on whether a young woman was believed to be a virgin. The rituals had changed. The humiliation had not. By the late 18th century, the world was changing at a breathtaking pace. Revolutions shook thrones, Enlightenment ideals challenged monarchies, and industrial progress was transforming society. Yet within the glittering courts of Europe, one relic of the medieval past stubbornly remained: the obsession with the virginity of royal brides. No longer conducted with priests hovering over bridal chambers, the rituals of proof had shifted into the realm of rumor, propaganda, and scandal. But the stakes were just as high. For a princess to be accused of lacking chastity, even falsely, was to face political ruin. Perhaps the most infamous example of this era was Marie Antoinette, the Austrian archduchess married to the French dauphin, Louis XVI. From the moment she arrived at Versailles in 1770, her virginity, and later, her ability to consummate the marriage, was a matter of national gossip. Courtiers whispered endlessly about the young couple's failure to produce children, and pamphlets mocked her as frigid, unnatural, or worse. Some even suggested she had not been a virgin at marriage, undermining her legitimacy as queen. These accusations were not about truth. They were about power. Marie Antoinette became a scapegoat for France's growing unrest, her body politicized until it was dragged before the guillotine. The 19th century saw this cruelty reach new forms, as monarchies fought to retain their crumbling power in a world of revolutions and nation-states. The reputation of queens and princesses became more vulnerable than ever. Scandal sheets, cheap newspapers, and gossip pamphlets thrived on stories of royal women's supposed impropriety. Their purity, or lack thereof, was headline material. In Spain, Queen Isabella II faced relentless attacks on her chastity. Rumors spread that she had been unfaithful, that she had never entered her marriage bed pure, that her children were not of royal blood. Her political enemies used these accusations to destabilize her reign, portraying her as both morally corrupt and politically illegitimate. The result was years of upheaval and her eventual exile, even in the conservative courts of Austria and Prussia, where tradition still held firm. Virginity remained a weapon. When alliances faltered, enemies whispered about brides not being untouched. When queens failed to produce heirs, pamphlets hinted at premarital impurity. A woman's honor became a tool of political warfare, sharpened by public opinion like never before. What made this era particularly cruel was the rise of mass media. In the Middle Ages, a princess's humiliation was contained to courtiers and clerics. By the 18th and 19th centuries, it was printed in newspapers read by merchants, peasants, and revolutionaries. The bedroom of a queen had become a public stage, her private life fodder for satire and scandal. Consider the British royal family in the Regency period. Caroline of Brunswick, wife of the future George IV, became the subject of one of the most notorious public trials of the 19th century. Accused of adultery and lacking chastity, she was put on trial before Parliament in 1820. Crowds gathered in the streets to hear the details. Pamphlets spread lurid accounts, and caricatures mocked her in marketplaces. Though acquitted, her reputation was destroyed. The so-called Queen Caroline affair exposed how the ancient obsession with female purity had been repackaged into public spectacle with devastating consequences. By now, virginity was less about physical tests and more about narratives. But the cruelty had not diminished. It had only changed costume. A queen might not face a midwife's inspection, but she faced something far more terrifying: the judgment of an entire nation, amplified by a press hungry for scandal. Behind every accusation, however, was the same brutal reality that had haunted medieval princesses: the female body treated as political property. Whether through ritual inspections in the 12th century or satirical pamphlets in the 19th, the message was the same: royal women were to be judged, controlled, and sacrificed for dynastic survival. By the end of the 19th century, revolutions and republics had toppled many thrones. Yet even in exile, queens and princesses carried the scars of these accusations. Their lives, their reputations, their memories were shaped by a centuries-old obsession that refused to die. And so, as we stand at the threshold of the modern era, we see the same story repeating. Virginity had ceased to be a medieval ritual, but it had not ceased to be a weapon. The only difference was the stage, once hidden in palaces, now broadcast to the world. Zunu Dedin, Devim et Chat GPT, Harika, O Hald Kimdi Secret Historians, the most horrific. Virginity Rituals of Medieval Princesses. Chapter 8, Final Chapter, Galir. Buba Blumd, Hai Ka, Tamam Layakagus. Orda Cogden 19, Uziela Keder Jelenbu, Bekare Takinsinen, Gislarini Gunamus Baglarak, and Ladikov. Chapter 8. The story of virginity rituals might feel like a tale locked in the pastoralic of medieval castles, royal treaties, and candlelit chambers. But the truth is darker. The obsession did not vanish with the guillotine or the revolutions of the 19th century. It lingers, woven into the fabric of modern culture, reshaped but recognizable. For centuries, the bodies of royal women had been inspected, humiliated, and politicized. By the dawn of the modern era, those rituals had largely disappeared in their medieval form. Priests no longer stood outside bridal chambers, and midwives no longer reported their findings to kings. Yet the logic behind those practices, the belief that a woman's worth, honor, and political value lay in her virginity, remained alive. In the 20th century, monarchies that survived adapted to a new world. Royal brides like Queen Elizabeth II or Princess Grace of Monaco were not subjected to physical examinations, but their purity was still a matter of public obsession. Tabloids speculated about engagements, courtships, and proper behavior. The question was no longer proven with blood-stained sheets, but with gossip columns and camera lenses. And in some cultures beyond Europe, remnants of the old rituals persisted in shocking ways. In parts of the Middle East, Africa, and Asia, so-called virginity tests were still practiced well into the late 20th and even 21st centuries, cloaked in the same language of honor and control that had once dominated medieval courts. Reports of such practices sparked international outrage, revealing that the shadows of medieval Europe were not confined to the past, but stretched across time and geography. What is perhaps most haunting is the continuity of silence. Then, as now, the women forced into these rituals often had no voice. Medieval princesses endured their humiliations in silence, their stories told only in whispers or twisted into propaganda. Modern women subjected to similar practices likewise find their experiences hidden, stigmatized, or erased. The silence of history echoes in the silence of the present. Yet there is also resilience in this story. Catherine of Aragon standing firm before Henry VIII's court. Joan of France turning humiliation into sainthood. Elizabeth I wielding the narrative to her advantage. These women remind us that even within systems designed to control, resistance was possible. Their defiance lit small flames in the darkness, flames that would grow brighter with time. The obsession with virginity tells us less about women than it does about power. It shows us how societies, whether medieval, early modern, or even modern sought to control women by defining their worth through their bodies. And it reminds us that the most intimate aspects of life can be turned into weapons of politics, propaganda, and domination. So as we close this story, let us remember what lies beneath the faded rituals of stained sheets and whispered examinations. Fear. Fear of illegitimacy. Fear of disorder. Fear of losing control. And let us remember the women princesses, queens, ordinary brides whose lives were shaped, scarred, or destroyed by these fears. Their names are scattered across history, some remembered, many forgotten. But together, they tell a story that still matters. Because in every culture where a woman's worth is measured not by her mind, her courage, or her humanity, but by the myths of purity, the echoes of the medieval virginity tests live on. And perhaps the most haunting truth of all is this: the obsession never truly died. It merely changed costume.